My name is Sarah, I'm 34, and I found out my business partner of 6 years had been quietly transferring our company's clients to a shell business he'd secretly registered through a routine email that was accidentally sent to me instead of his lawyer. I ran, a marketing agency that Marcus and I built together from nothing, starting in his cramped apartment living room with 2 laptops and a shared conviction that we could do better work than the agencies we'd both left. 6 years later, we had 18 employees, a real office downtown, and a client roster that included 3 companies most people would recognize by name. The email arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, meant for his attorney. Subject line simply reading, transition plan, final draft. I almost didn't open it, assuming it was routine business correspondence accidentally CC'd to the wrong recipient. Instead, it was a detailed legal strategy for moving our 5 largest clients to a new entity Marcus had quietly incorporated 4 months earlier, an entity I had never heard of, structured specifically to extract them from our existing contracts without triggering the non-compete clauses we'd both signed years earlier. I remember reading the sender line twice, then the subject line again, before actually opening the attachment, some instinctive part of me already bracing for whatever I was about to find, even before I fully understood what I was looking at. I read the email 3 times before the full shape of what I was looking at became clear. Marcus had been planning this for months, methodically, carefully, while sitting across from me in weekly partner meetings discussing quarterly targets, as if everything between us remained exactly as it had always been. The document outlined specific dates, already scheduled, for formal transition conversations with each of the 5 clients, conversations designed to happen over the following 6 weeks, timed, I realized with a sinking feeling, to occur right after our company's annual client retention bonuses had already been paid out based on numbers that would soon be rendered meaningless. I sat at my desk for nearly an hour after reading it, staring at the numbers in that document, doing rough mental math on what losing those 5 clients would mean, not just for the company's revenue, but for the 18 employees whose jobs depended on contracts Marcus was actively working to dismantle behind my back. I remember closing my laptop at one point, standing up, walking to the window of my office, and just staring down at the street below for several minutes, trying to convince some part of my brain that I'd misread something, that there was an innocent explanation buried somewhere in that document I simply hadn't found yet. There wasn't one. I checked twice more before finally accepting what the email actually said. I didn't confront Marcus that same day. Instead, I went home, sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine I barely touched, and read through the document a 4th time, this time taking careful notes, screenshotting everything, forwarding copies to my personal email in case I somehow lost access to my work account before I'd properly documented what I'd found. I called my sister that night, a corporate attorney herself, though not one specializing in partnership disputes, and read her the relevant portions of the document over the phone. She was quiet for a long moment before telling me, gently but firmly, that I needed to consult a specialized attorney immediately before doing anything else, before even confronting Marcus directly, since anything I said or did in the meantime could potentially affect my legal position later. I didn't sleep much that night, running through 6 years of memories with Marcus, searching for signs I might have missed, moments of unusual behavior I'd previously dismissed as simple stress or distraction, now recontextualized as possible evidence of the secret planning that had apparently been unfolding for months, right alongside our normal working relationship. I met with a business litigation attorney the following morning, a referral from my sister's professional network, someone experienced specifically in partnership dissolution disputes. She reviewed the document I'd found and told me directly, without softening the assessment, that what I was looking at represented a serious breach of fiduciary duty, potentially actionable under our existing partnership agreement. She advised me to say nothing to Marcus yet, to instead begin quietly gathering additional documentation, financial records, communications, anything that might reveal the full scope of what he'd been planning, before he had any opportunity to cover his tracks or destroy evidence once he realized I knew. That advice proved harder to follow than I expected, sitting across from Marcus in a partner meeting just 2 days later, discussing routine quarterly numbers, maintaining a normal professional demeanor while privately working through legal strategy with an attorney he had no idea I'd already retained. The dissonance of that performance, smiling through a meeting while secretly preparing for a legal battle, remains one of the strangest experiences of the entire ordeal. I confronted Marcus 8 days after discovering the email, once my attorney and I had gathered sufficient additional documentation to have a clear picture of the situation. I met him in his office, with the printed email and several supporting documents laid out on the desk between us. He didn't deny it immediately, which told me almost everything I needed to know before he said a single word in his own defense. He sat back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and said, "I was going to tell you eventually," a statement that struck me as almost insulting given how detailed and deliberate his planning had clearly been. He said he'd grown frustrated over the past year with what he characterized as unequal effort between us, that he felt he'd been carrying more of the client relationships while I focused on internal operations, and that he deserved a bigger share of what we'd built than our 50-50 partnership agreement currently allowed. I asked him why, if he genuinely believed that, he hadn't simply raised it directly, proposed a renegotiation of our partnership terms, had an honest conversation instead of secretly building an entire parallel business designed to steal the exact clients we'd both spent years cultivating together. He didn't have a satisfying answer, just a vague statement about not believing I'd agree to renegotiate fairly, which felt, even in the moment, like a convenient justification for choosing deception over the much harder work of honest negotiation. We met again 2 days later, this time with both of our attorneys present, a considerably more formal and considerably more tense conversation than our initial confrontation. Marcus's attorney attempted to frame the shell company as simply exploring future opportunities, language my own attorney dismantled fairly quickly by referencing the specific, already scheduled client transition dates outlined in the original document. Marcus himself said relatively little during that second meeting, deferring mostly to his attorney's careful, legally cautious language, a contrast to the more direct, if unsatisfying, explanation he'd offered during our initial one-on-one conversation. I found myself studying his face throughout the meeting, searching for some sign of genuine remorse rather than simply strategic caution now that lawyers were formally involved. The meeting ended without resolution, both sides agreeing to consider next steps separately before any further direct conversation, a formal, careful distance that felt strange given 6 years of daily, informal collaboration that had defined our entire working relationship up until 8 days earlier. The following months became consumed almost entirely by lawyers, forensic accountants, and a partnership dispute that unfolded far more publicly within our industry than either of us would have wanted. The formal dissolution proceedings began within 3 weeks of the initial confrontation, once it became clear that no informal resolution would be possible. The forensic accounting revealed details even worse than the initial email had suggested. Marcus had been diverting small amounts of company resources toward building his shell business for nearly 8 months, not 4, using our shared design software licenses, borrowing language directly from proposals I had personally written, essentially building his competing business using tools and material funded by our shared company. I remember the specific moment our forensic accountant called to walk me through her preliminary findings, her voice carefully neutral in the way professionals maintain even when delivering genuinely damaging information, listing expense after expense that Marcus had quietly funneled toward his secret venture using resources both of us technically owned jointly. The deposition process, something I'd only previously understood through television dramatizations, proved considerably more grueling in reality than anything I'd anticipated. Marcus's own deposition, which I wasn't present for but received detailed notes from my attorney afterward, apparently included several moments where his account of specific timeline details contradicted the forensic accounting evidence already gathered, inconsistencies my attorney noted would likely prove valuable during eventual settlement negotiations. The entire process took 11 months to fully resolve, involving depositions, mediation sessions that occasionally became so tense our respective lawyers had to separate us into different rooms, and a final settlement that recovered some, though far from all, of what Marcus's secret planning had already cost the company by the time everything became formal and public. One mediation session in particular, roughly 6 months into the process, remains vivid in my memory. Marcus and I found ourselves briefly alone in a hallway during a scheduled break, our respective attorneys having stepped away separately for phone calls. He said, quietly, that he hadn't anticipated how badly this would damage our actual friendship, a comment that struck me as almost absurdly naive, given that friendship damage seemed like the obvious, predictable consequence of secretly building a competing business behind a partner's back for 8 months. I told him, as calmly as I could manage, that friendship damage wasn't really the primary concern I'd been focused on during the preceding 6 months, that 18 employees' livelihoods and years of built trust mattered considerably more than whatever personal relationship existed between the two of us at this point. He didn't have a response to that, and our attorneys returned from their calls shortly afterward, ending what remains one of the few genuinely direct, unmediated conversations we had throughout the entire 11-month process. The hardest part of the entire ordeal, harder even than the personal betrayal itself, was watching what it did to our 18 employees, people who had built careers around a company that was now unraveling because of decisions made entirely without their knowledge or consent. I called an all-staff meeting the week after discovering Marcus's plan, choosing transparency over the alternative of letting rumors and half-information spread through the office on their own. I told them directly what had happened, what I knew, what remained uncertain, and what I was doing to try to protect their jobs through whatever came next. 6 employees left within the first 2 months, taking positions at other agencies rather than wait out the uncertainty of a company mid-dissolution. I understood their choices completely, even as each departure felt like another small loss stacked on top of an already overwhelming year. The remaining 12 stayed, a loyalty that meant more to me during that period than I think I fully expressed to them at the time, too consumed by crisis management to properly acknowledge how much their continued trust actually mattered. About 3 months into the process, I held a smaller, more informal gathering with the remaining 12 employees, not a formal all-staff meeting but a casual after-work conversation, the kind we used to have regularly before everything became consumed by crisis management. I told them, more honestly than I had in the initial formal meeting, how uncertain I genuinely felt about the company's future, how much their continued presence meant to me personally beyond simply their professional value to the business. Several of them shared their own perspectives, some expressing anger at Marcus directly. Others focused more practically on questions about job security and the company's actual financial stability going forward. That conversation, unstructured and honest in a way the formal announcements hadn't quite managed to be, became something of a turning point in team morale, a shared acknowledgement of difficulty that somehow made the ongoing uncertainty feel more bearable for everyone involved, myself included. Of our 5 largest clients targeted in Marcus's original transition plan, 3 ultimately chose to stay with the reorganized company I retained control of, while 2 followed Marcus to his new venture, decisions that felt, in the moment, like a referendum on which of us they trusted more going forward. I had direct, difficult conversations with each of the 5 clients personally, explaining the situation honestly rather than through the sanitized corporate language our lawyers initially suggested. I've come to believe that honesty, even when it revealed genuinely embarrassing internal conflict, ultimately served the company better than a carefully managed narrative would have. The 2 clients who left weren't unkind about it, exactly, but their departure still stung in a specific, professional way that felt different from personal betrayal, a reminder that business relationships, however genuine, ultimately operate under different rules than friendship. Rules I had perhaps naively underestimated during 6 years of assuming client loyalty ran deeper than it apparently did for everyone involved. One client in particular, our largest account, surprised me during this period in a way I hadn't anticipated. Their marketing director, someone I'd worked closely with for nearly 4 years, called me directly rather than waiting for a formal meeting, saying she'd heard rumors within the industry and wanted to hear the situation directly from me before making any decisions. I told her everything honestly, including details I probably wasn't strictly required to disclose, trusting that the relationship we'd built over 4 years of genuinely collaborative work deserved that level of transparency even amid an uncertain, difficult situation. She stayed with the reorganized company, telling me afterward that my directness during that call had actually strengthened her confidence in continuing the partnership, rather than the alternative outcome I'd privately feared. That specific conversation taught me something valuable about client relationships that I carried forward through the rest of the crisis. That genuine transparency, even about difficult internal conflict, tended to build more durable trust than carefully managed narratives designed to minimize apparent instability. Working with a business coach during those months taught me things about my own blind spots that I hadn't fully examined before everything fell apart. I'd built our entire partnership on an assumption of equal trust, equal transparency, without ever building in the kind of structural safeguards that might have caught Marcus's planning months earlier, before it had metastasized into something this damaging. I learned that I had a pattern, throughout both my professional and personal life, of avoiding difficult conversations about resentment or perceived unfairness, assuming problems would resolve themselves naturally rather than requiring direct confrontation. Marcus's own admission, however self-serving, contained an uncomfortable grain of truth. I probably had, in some ways, avoided harder conversations about how we divided responsibilities and credit within the partnership. That realization didn't excuse what he did. Nothing excuses 6 months of secret planning behind a partner's back. But it did teach me something valuable about building future professional relationships with much clearer structures, more explicit expectations, and regular, uncomfortable check-ins rather than assuming goodwill would carry a partnership indefinitely without active maintenance. Word travels fast within a specific professional industry, and our very public partnership dispute became something of a cautionary tale discussed at industry conferences and in private group chats among people who knew us both, sometimes with more detail and more speculation than the actual facts warranted. Some colleagues reached out with genuine support, sharing their own stories of business partnerships that had similarly fractured, offering practical advice about rebuilding client trust and stabilizing a company after this kind of upheaval. Others seemed to treat the entire situation as industry gossip, a dramatic story to discuss rather than an actual professional crisis affecting real people's livelihoods. I had to develop a thicker skin during that period than I'd ever needed before, learning to separate useful professional feedback from what amounted to entertainment for people who had no real stake in how things ultimately resolved for either me or the employees still depending on the company for their income. An industry conference roughly 7 months into the ordeal became an unexpectedly difficult experience, one I'd almost skipped entirely rather than face the inevitable questions and sideways glances from colleagues who'd heard some version of what had happened. I ultimately decided to attend, partly out of professional necessity, partly out of a stubborn refusal to let Marcus's actions dictate which professional opportunities one felt comfortable participating in. Several colleagues approached me directly throughout the 2-day event, some with genuine warmth and support, others with the kind of overly curious questions that felt more extractive than sympathetic. Marcus, I learned afterward, had also attended, though we managed to avoid any direct interaction throughout the entire conference, a small mercy given how emotionally exhausting an unplanned face-to-face encounter would likely have been in that particular professional setting. Rebuilding the company after the formal dissolution process concluded meant essentially starting over in several key ways, even though I retained the original company name, the office space, and roughly 2/3 of our original client base and employees. I restructured the entire operational model during those first few months, building in far more transparency around finances and decision-making than had existed under the previous partnership structure, partly as genuine best practice, partly as a way of proving to remaining employees and clients that the kind of secrecy that had characterized Marcus's plan wouldn't be tolerated or possible going forward. It took nearly a full year before revenue returned to pre-crisis levels, a slower recovery than I'd initially hoped for, but one that felt more solid, more sustainable, built on a foundation with far fewer blind spots than the one that had allowed this entire situation to develop undetected for 8 months in the first place. About 9 months after the dissolution concluded, I hired a new director of operations, someone whose primary responsibility included exactly the kind of financial oversight and transparency structures I'd identified as missing from the original partnership arrangement with Marcus. That hire, a woman named Denise with a background specifically in operational risk management, proved instrumental in rebuilding not just the company's practical structures, but my own confidence in the business's stability going forward. Having someone specifically responsible for catching exactly the kind of quiet financial irregularities that had gone unnoticed for 8 months provided a level of reassurance that felt genuinely necessary rather than simply symbolic. Denise and I built a working relationship over the following months that felt fundamentally different from my partnership with Marcus, characterized by regular, sometimes uncomfortable check-ins about financial details and decision-making authority, precisely the kind of structural transparency I'd previously assumed wasn't necessary between people who trusted each other. It's been just over a year now since that email landed in my inbox by accident. The company operates differently now, more transparently, with a leadership structure that no longer concentrates as much unchecked authority in a single person's hands, myself included, a deliberate choice informed directly by watching how much damage unchecked authority had caused when it had been Marcus holding it in secret. I heard through industry contacts that Marcus's new venture struggled significantly during its first year, that at least one of the two clients who'd initially followed him eventually returned to work with other agencies entirely, apparently disappointed by service quality that couldn't match what our original larger team had been able to provide. I don't feel triumphant about that news, exactly. Though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some complicated satisfaction buried underneath the professional neutrality I try to maintain when his name comes up. Mostly I feel a kind of tired relief that the worst of the crisis is genuinely behind me now, replaced by the much more mundane, much more welcome challenge of simply running a healthy company again. I want to specifically acknowledge the 12 employees who chose to stay throughout the entire 11-month legal process, because their loyalty during that period shaped the company's recovery more than almost any strategic decision I personally made. 2 of them, in particular, took on significantly expanded responsibilities during the crisis, essentially helping me hold the company together operationally while I was consumed by legal meetings, client conversations, and the emotional weight of processing the betrayal itself. I promoted both of them formally once the dissolution concluded, not as a symbolic gesture, but as genuine recognition of how much the company's survival depended on their steady presence during the worst months. That experience taught me something about loyalty that I hadn't fully appreciated before the crisis forced me to see it clearly. The people who show up during genuine difficulty, who don't need to be asked twice to take on extra weight during a crisis, deserve a different, deeper kind of trust and investment than people simply performing competence during easier, uneventful periods. Beyond the structural and financial changes, I noticed a genuine shift in company culture emerge over the year following the dissolution, one I hadn't specifically engineered, but that developed naturally from having survived a genuinely difficult shared crisis together. Employees seemed more willing to raise concerns directly, having watched firsthand what unchecked, unaddressed problems could eventually become if left unspoken for too long. Regular team meetings became more genuinely collaborative, less performative, shaped by a collective understanding of how much damage silence and assumed goodwill alone could ultimately cause. I want to specifically acknowledge the 12 employees who chose to stay throughout the entire 11-month legal process, because their loyalty during that period shaped the company's recovery more than almost any strategic decision I personally made. 2 of them, in particular, took on significantly expanded responsibilities during the crisis, essentially helping me hold the company together operationally while I was consumed by legal meetings, client conversations, and the emotional weight of processing the betrayal itself. I promoted both of them formally once the dissolution concluded, not as a symbolic gesture, but as genuine recognition of how much the company's survival depended on their steady presence during the worst months. That experience taught me something about loyalty that I hadn't fully appreciated before the crisis forced me to see it clearly. The people who show up during genuine difficulty, who don't need to be asked twice to take on extra weight during a crisis, deserve a different, deeper kind of trust and investment than people simply performing competence during easier, uneventful periods. Beyond the structural and financial changes, I noticed a genuine shift in company culture emerge over the year following the dissolution, one I hadn't specifically engineered, but that developed naturally from having survived a genuinely difficult shared crisis together. Employees seemed more willing to raise concerns directly, having watched firsthand what unchecked, unaddressed problems could eventually become if left unspoken for too long. Regular team meetings became more genuinely collaborative, less performative, shaped by a collective understanding of how much damage silence and assumed goodwill alone could ultimately cause. I found myself, somewhat unexpectedly, grateful for this particular outcome of an otherwise devastating year, a genuine improvement in how the entire team communicated and operated together that I doubted would have developed organically without the shared experience of navigating the crisis together. If another business owner came to me today, having just discovered a partner secretly working to undermine or dismantle something they'd built together, there are things I'd want them to understand from direct experience. I'd tell them that acting quickly, documenting everything, and consulting a specialized attorney immediately matters more than trying to process the emotional betrayal first. The business decisions you make in the first weeks after discovering something like this often matter more for long-term outcomes than however you're currently feeling about the personal dimension of the betrayal, painful as that feeling genuinely is. I'd also tell them that transparency with employees and clients, even when it reveals genuinely uncomfortable internal conflict, tends to serve better long-term outcomes than carefully managed narratives designed to minimize embarrassment. People generally respect honesty about difficulty more than they respect discovering later that they'd been kept in the dark about something that directly affected them. I haven't taken on a new formal business partner since the dissolution, a deliberate choice rather than simply an unresolved fear I haven't gotten around to addressing. I've built the current leadership structure instead around a small executive team with clearly defined, contractually explicit responsibilities and regular financial transparency built into the operational rhythm of the company itself. Some colleagues have suggested this reflects an overcorrection, an unwillingness to trust again in a way that might limit future growth opportunities that a strong partnership could otherwise provide. I understand that perspective, but I've made peace with prioritizing structural safeguards over the kind of informal trust-based partnership model that allowed 8 months of secret planning to go completely undetected the first time around. Trust, I've learned, works best alongside verification, not as a replacement for it. That's not cynicism. It's simply a lesson learned directly, at considerable professional and personal cost, about what happens when an entire partnership structure depends on goodwill alone with no structural checks built in to catch problems before they metastasize into full-blown crises. I want to end this by talking about who I've become as a business owner through this entire ordeal, because I think that transformation matters more than any specific detail of the betrayal itself. I'm a more careful leader now, more attentive to the specific dynamics and resentments simmering beneath the surface of professional relationships, more willing to have uncomfortable conversations early rather than letting problems compound silently over months the way they clearly did within my partnership with Marcus. I'm also, somewhat unexpectedly, a more confident leader than I was before, having proven to myself, through 11 genuinely brutal months, that I could hold a company together through crisis, rebuild client trust from a damaged foundation, and emerge with something more stable and more honest than what existed before everything fell apart. The company I run today isn't the company Marcus and I built together 6 years ago. It's something new, built more deliberately, with fewer blind spots, shaped directly by the hardest professional lesson I've ever had to learn. And for the first time in over a year, I'm building it forward instead of simply trying to survive what someone else tried to take from me.